Good day, dear students. We start our today's lecture. Our topic is devoted to formation of the Russian autocracy in the 16th century. Also, I will tell you about time of troubles and its consequences. So, today we have two questions to be discussed. First of them, strengthening of the government of Ivan IV, and the second one is known as time of troubles. Time of troubles. Additional literature will be helpful for you in exploration of this topic. Please look through Cambridge History of Russia, volume the first, pages 204-9, 206-4. And a brief history of Russia. A brief history of Russia will be helpful also for us, pages from 30 to 40. Well, let's have a look at our slide. Parents of Ivan IV, Ivan the Terrible, are presented here. On the left side, a mother of Ivan the Terrible's, Yelena Glinskaya. On the right side, the father is Vasily III, the Grand Duke of all the Russia. Ivan IV, first Russian Tsar, was born in 1530. He was parents' long-awaited child, and from very moment of his born, he hid with a leg strongly the grandma midwife, who took it on hands, and she told, "The child has two hearts, one kind, another angry." When Ivan was 3 years old, his father died. In 5 years also his mother died. So he stood absolutely alone. And the boy grew in a situation of race for power between his assistants, boyars, hostility, deception and murders. Therefore it became very suspicious and angry. It already in the childhood tormented cats and dogs and became ruthlessly dealt shortly later with people who surrounded it. What should we know about Glinsky? Glinsky's family. On Glinsky's legend occurred from the Tatar Khan Mamai, whose children ran to Lithuania and received there in destiny the city of Glinsk, who began to be called Glinsky. To another legend, the fact that this event had to take place at the beginning of the 15th century, however, Glinsky's princes are mentioned documentary only in 1437. The Prince Mikhail Glinsky, Yelena's uncle, was the diplomatic doctor and the knight of the Secret Roman Empire. At one time he even participated in the administration of Lithuanian Principality and lifted a mutiny there. The mutiny was suppressed, and Glinsky, it was necessary to run. So the beautiful Yelena appeared in Russia. Let's have a look at Yelena Glinskaya. Yelena Glinskaya was indeed beautiful, and the major moment in her government is holding a monetary reform. It is begun in 1535. It actually ended single currency in the territory of Russia. Let's have a look at our slide. Here is a picture of kopek, a special Russian coin initially introduced by Yelena Glinskaya in Russian economy, kopek. Why it is called a kopek? It is called in honor of Saint George. Saint George won battle with a snake, and this process is devoted to you at the kopek, and that's why kopek sounds like copy. Copy is in the hand of Saint George. Saint George killed snake, and that's why this skin is illustrated an emblem of Moscow. Yelena Glinskaya died on a 4th of April in 1538, and by her say she was poisoned by Shuisky. This research of its remains specified by a presumable cause of death poisoning with poison, mercury. But the poisoning fact is not recognized today by historians as indisputable and not raising doubts. Yelena was buried in the Kremlin in Voznesensky convent. So, after 1538, Ivan IV Vasilievich stood totally alone. What do we know about Ivan IV? Years of his rule, from 1533 to 1584. He was first Russian Tsar. Since 1533, the Grand Duke of all the Russia, in 1547 he became the Tsar. In 1549-1561 he undertook reforms which captured all system of the public relations. So, there are two parts of his government. First part we should call a reform time. She was a great reformer during the first part of his rule, and during the second part of his rule, Ivan IV became a well-known tyrant, so-called tyrant, and he got nickname Ivan the Terrible for his participation in organization of Oprichnina, in terror against Russian people. In 1547, Ivan IV got married to Anastasia Romanovna Zakharina Koshkina. She died in 1560. It is the most favorite of all 7 wives of the Tsar Ivan. So, Tsar Ivan IV, during his life, had 7 marriages, and Anastasia Zakharina was his last wife and the first one among his wives. Choosing council, or elected Rada, we can meet 2 titles of this body, governmental body, choosing council or elected Rada. It was council of the elite, narrow circle of people, adherents, some kind of government. It played the major role by preparation and carrying out reforms of 1549-1561. Several peoples were in content of choosing council or elected Rada. Let's have a look. Adashev, Sylvester, Makary, Viskovati and Kurbsky. All of them are listed at our slide. And talking about reforms of a choosing council or elected Rada, we should remember reform of system of public administration, church reform, tax and monetary reform, and military reform. So, four reforms of Ivan IV and choosing council were popular and very prominent. Let's start with analysis of reform of system of public administration. During this reform, special bodies of central government in Russia were created. I mean order. The orders were bodies of the central public administration in Moscow managing public affairs or certain areas of the state. Also, in a sphere of public administration, Ivan IV cancelled fittings and replacement with their salesmen heads and voivodes. In 1549, a first territorial cathedral in Russia was convocated as a part of representatives of the nobility, clergy, town people and trade people. So, what does it mean territorial cathedral? Territorial cathedral was the highest class representatives institution in Russia in the mid of 16th and end of the 17th centuries. Let's have a look at our consequent slide. Here is a picture of territorial cathedral. And on the right side of our slide you can see boyars. Boyars, how they looked like. Boyars. Boyars were a very remarkable part of Russian society, and boyars were very influential. Tsar was connected with boyars, and Tsar tried to rule together with boyars, with the help of first territorial cathedrals in Russia. Let's have a look at our consequent slide. Code of laws. Code of laws. What does it mean, the code of laws? Code of laws was the collection of laws of the Russian state in the 16th century and in a mid of 15th century. What were the results of introduction of Code of Laws of 1551? It was a limitation of power of deputies. It was expansion of the right of a soldier of a state. It was a statement of the right of free transition of peasants from one landowner to another on St. George's Day. And let's have a look. Let's have a look to the position of peasants. As you remember, during this time, peasantry in Russia lived in a very poor conditions, and we can talk about existence of serfdom during this time. So, the Code of Laws of 1551 introduced serfdom with one thing as St. George's Day. St. George's Day was one exception from serfdom. During this day, each peasant had a special right to transition from one landowner to another landowner, St. George's Day. The Code of Laws protected honor of any member of Russian society. However, penalties for dishonor differed greatly. For example, for dishonor of a city merchant, the offender paid a fine of 50 rubles. For dishonor of a town person, 5 rubles, the peasant 1 ruble. Let's have a look at church reform. Church reform. Church reforms. In 1551 in Moscow, at will of Ivan the Terrible, seeking for strengthening of the centralized power and extremely anxious with the condition of church affairs, the church cathedral took place. It was a very large church cathedral, and church attendance headed by the Metropolitan Makarin and a seigneurial third participated in the basic of it. Acts of cathedral were listed in the final collection, which consisted of 100 chapters. From here the name of cathedral 100-headed went. 100-headed went. 100 heads the collection of resolutions of church cathedral of 1551. The book was divided in initiation, the Code of Laws of 1550, into 100 chapters, from where its title. What were consequences? Ivan IV's attempt to limit church land tenure did not find support among boyars and among church representatives. The authorities reduced privileges of religious institutions. The church could accept new lands only with permission of a supreme power now. The next reform was the reform of taxation and money turnover. The tax system was ordered as a unit of taxation. There was plough. Plough, the size of the arable land with which the tax was withdrawn. And look at our slide. You can see a picture of process of taxation in medieval Russia, in the Russia of 15th century. A special Russian currency, Moscow ruble, was introduced during this reform, and several new taxes were introduced also. For example, guns money, a tax collected on keeping of army, prisoners' money, a tax for repayment of captives, and all taxes also existed during this period of time, such as postal money, a tax on post service, town business, a tax for city building and fortresses. Military reform. Look at our slide, please. At our slide, you can see so-called shooters. Why do we call them shooters? Shooters were the basis of newly created army. Ivan IV decided to strengthen Russian army. Shooters were equipped with firearms, and that's why they were called shooters. Their service, unlike noble cavalry, was constant and paid. So, shooters were professionals. They were military professionals. In 1556, the code about service, which regulated passing of military service, was for the first time made. For the border service, Cossacks were attracted. Foreigners became one more component of the Russian army, but their number was insignificant. For the period of military campaigns, the regionalism was limited. So, Talking about military reform, we can conclude that this reform was very successful, and thanks to this reform, Ivan IV could provide a very active foreign policy. He succeeded eastward. He included Kazan Khanate, Astrakhan Khanate in borders of Moscow Kingdom, in borders of Russian state. And now let's discuss Oprichnina, one of the most complicated issues of the time of rule of Ivan IV. What does it mean, Oprichnina? You can write this word as it's spelled at our slide, Oprichnina, from the Russian word oprich. Oprich we could translate into English as except, especially. Oprichnina as a regime of political power during the time of rule of Ivan IV officially existed since the end of 1564 until the 1572. It was a fighting against the remains of specific orders and seeking to destroy the slightest oppositional moods. Ivan IV arranged cruel terror. So Ivan IV was known enough throughout the world for his terror acts, and he introduced Oprichnina as a kind of terror against his compatriots. A total number of oprichniks is estimated on 3,000–4,000 persons, and 3,000–4,000 persons died from oprichnik terror. What were the purposes of Oprichnina? Establishment of Oprichnina was one of the purposes of establishment of Oprichnina was establishment of absolute power of the Tsar. Also, it was a fight against the feudal aristocracy, independence of nobility. The next purpose was elimination of the remains of feudal dissociation, specific reignings, Novgorod outlaws, and the last purpose of Ivan during the introduction of Oprichnina was to overcome failures of the Livonian War. The thing is that Ivan IV participated in Livonian War more than 2 decades, and Livonian War was totally unsuccessful for him and for Russian state. What were prerequisites of Oprichnina? In March of 1553, Ivan IV was seriously ill and was close to death. Boyars take the oath not to his son Dmitri, as he expected, but to the cousin of the Tsar, to Vladimir Andreevich Staritsky, because Vladimir Andreevich Staritsky was adult and Ivan Grozny's son Dmitri was rather young and not adult. In 1560, the main figures of elected Rada, and in 1562–1563, their supporters underwent disgrace and were repressed. On December the 3rd of 1564, Ivan IV, together with family and his Yar, left to the Alexandrovsky settlement. From there he sends to Moscow 2 diplomas with accusations of boyar traitors. So he accused boyars of being traitors, but the announcement to ordinary people that the anger and does not have disgrace on them. Muscovites asked humbly Ivan IV that the Tsar should return on the kingdom, and in February of 1565 the Tsar established Oprichnina, having demanded permission without counsel with boyars to scourge on traitors. What do we know about oprichniks? A total number of oprichnik army differs from 1,000 people to 6,000 people. An average quantity of oprichniks is estimated in 3–4,000 people. At once, the group of 500 especially entrusted service people who made protection and suite of the Tsar was allocated. Oprichnik's appearance was very horrible, as you can imagine. Talking about leaders of Oprichniks, we can mention Basmanov, Prince Vyazemsky, Zaitsev, nobleman Belsky, Maluta Skuratov. A very well-known picture illustrated us an appearance of Oprichnik. The black clothes of rough cloth attached to a saddle, the dog head, you can see at the slide, dog head attached to a saddle of guardsmen. It meant that servants, guardsmen like dogs will now to a traitors and will sweep out all treason from the Moscow state. Very clearly guardsmen directed horror at passers. They were really and actually horrible. They looked very horrible. Talking about activity of Oprichnina, almost right after the adoption of the decree on Oprichnina, executions began. In 1570, Novgorod and Pskov were ruined. Novgorod especially suffered. In total 4 years of Oprichnina, more than 4,000 people were executed. In 1571, the Oprichnik army could not stop the Crimean Khan Devlet-Giray. As a result, Moscow was burned. The imperial anger addressed on guardsmen. At the beginning of the 1570s, a guardsman Basmanov, Vyazemsky, Zaitsev, Mikhail Cherkassky and others were executed. In 1572, the Tsar forbade the word Oprichnina. For its use, cruel punishment by a whip followed. And Ivan the Terrible, you see, Ivan the Terrible was very contradictory ruler. Why? Because after the end of Oprichnina, after he forbade Oprichnina, he reconsidered the relation to execute it in days of Oprichnina. Under his order, under his decree, it was made synodic, the funeral list executed for the peace or which soul it was necessary to pray in all churches and monasteries. So, Ivan IV tried to pray for the victims of his terror. Let's go to foreign policy of Ivan the Terrible exploration. We shall start with the western direction of the foreign policy, as I told you previously. The Livonian War started in 1558 and ended in 1583. Livonian War was called in honor of Livonian Award, and after the beginning of war, Livonian Award was crushed, but its lands passed under the control of Poland, Denmark and Sweden. So instead of one weak opponent, Livonian Order, Livonian Award, Russia received 3 strong enemies as Sweden, Denmark and Poland. Andrei Kurbsky treated to Ivan IV, and Andrei Kurbsky's treachery and Oprichnina aggravated war. The Livonian War was ended by defeat of Russia. An exit to the Baltic Sea, as you can see at our slide map, an exit to the Baltic Sea did not manage to be received, and foreign trade was still carried out through the White Sea. It was very uncomfortable for Russian merchants to provide trade through the White Sea and Arkhangelsk, because the way through Arkhangelsk to Great Britain, for example, was very difficult. Let's go to the second direction of foreign policy of Ivan the Terrible, I mean eastern direction. Eastern direction was much more successful than western direction, and on east direction fight against the Kazan and Astrakhan Khanates, annexation of Siberia was the main goal. The Kazan and Astrakhan Khanates formed as a result of disintegration of Golden Horde, constantly threatened Russian lands. They were fertile soils of which the Russian nobility dreamed. Let's remember our date. In 1552, Kazan Khanate was attached, and Kazan was taken by storm by Russian troops. In 1556, the Astrakhan Khanate was attached to Moscow Kingdom also. Astrakhan was captured. The dependence on Russia was recognized by the Nogai Horde, lands from Volga to Irtysh. Such peoples as Tatars, Bashkirs, Udmurts, Mordva, Maris were a part of Russia. Communications with the people of the North Caucasus and Central Asia extended. New fertile lands and old trade way across the Volga River, it appeared under control of Russia. So, during this period of time, Volga River became a main trade route for Russia, as Dnieper during the time of Old Rus. Accession of Kazan and Astrakhan opened an opportunity for advance to Siberia. Siberia was the eastward part of lands and rich merchants of Stroganov received from Ivan IV diplomas on possession of lands down the river to Tobol, and equipped with a firearms regiment led by Russian Cossack Yermak, started his advance to Siberia. In 1581, Yermak with his army got on the territory of the Siberian Khanate, and his military opponent presented to you at this slide was Kuchum, Siberian Khan Kuchum. A year later broke troops of the Khan Kuchum. Yermak broke troops of Khan Kuchum and took capital of Kuchum with the title Kashlik or Sibir. So a capital of Siberian Khan Kuchum was titled Sibir, and thanks to the title of this city, Sibir, all the land was called Siberia. The population of Siberia had to pay yasak, a kind of natural quit rent in fur, a kind of taxation. Southward to Russian lands, on the southern direction, protection of country against attacks of Crimean Tatars, as in the 16th century, development of the territory of the wild field began. So, a territory between possessions of Russian lands and possessions of the Crimean Khan and Turkish Ottoman Empire Sultan was called as wild field. The Tula and Belgorod frontier lines were constructed as a border, as a frontier line between two countries. In 1571, the Crimean Khan with army reached Moscow and burned its posad, or suburbs of Moscow. The Oprishnik army could not resist to it, and having induced probably the Tsar to cancel Oprichnina. But Ivan the Terrible was able to destroy Tatars' regiments in 1572 in fight at Molody. The Crimean troops were beaten by the United Russian Army. Talking about the results of Ivan the Terrible government, we should conclude that activity of the first Russian Tsar should be estimated, taking into account time of his life. It was forced to apply repressions to nobility, as at that time the top of nobility became anti-state force. By the latest calculations of scientists, In 37 years of board of Ivan the Terrible's order, from 3 to 4,000 people were destroyed. For comparison, his contemporary French king Karl IX, only in 1572, from favoring of the Pope, destroyed 30,000 Huguenots, Catholic Protestants, during one night, only one night. And Ivan the Terrible undoubtedly was a despot, a tyrant, but the despotism of the Tsar was caused by those internal and external circumstances in which there were Russia in the middle of the 16th century. Don't forget about it, please. And let's underline once again that we should estimate the activity of Ivan the Terrible as a very contradictory process, with the successes and with the terror also, simultaneously. And now, let's go to exploration of time of troubles. What does it mean, time of troubles? Time of troubles was a time of change and doubts. It was a time of new opportunities. It was era of civil war, and it was an era of statement of a new dynasty, dynasty of Romanovs, instead of dynasty of Rurikids. What did happen with the children of Ivan the IV? As we do know, Ivan the IV initially had 3 sons. One of his sons died, probably he was killed by Ivan the IV himself. According to another version, he died from a complicated illness. And a young son of Ivan the IV, Tsarevich Dmitri, was killed when he was not adult, and the maid son of Ivan the IV, Fyodor Ivanovich, came to power after the death of his father in 1584. So, years of rule of Fyodor Ivanovich. Here is a portrait of him, right side, Fyodor Ivanovich. Years of his rule from 1584 to 1598. Fyodor Ivanovich was a rather educated person. He was kind. He was rather educated, he was kind, but according to the point of view of many our historians, he was so-called blessed, because he was a very strange person, and his kind was estimated by his boyars as a witness of being blessed, in contradiction to his father, cruel Ivan IV. Who was Boris Godunov? Boris Godunov. Here is a portrait of him. Boris Godunov was a closest boyar, closest to Ivan IV during the end of his life, and he was from a family of the Kostroma nobleman Godunov. It is brought up by the uncle, the Gwodzman Godunov. Since 1517, he is married to Maluta Skurato's daughter Maria. In 1578, he married the sisters Irina to the Tsarevich Fyodor. Since 1581, he became boyar. Since 1584, the Great Nia Boyar and the Inquirer. Since 1585, he became an actual governor of the state, of the Russian state. What do we know about activity, state activity of Fyodor Ivanovich and state activity of Boris Godunov, who was a real governor of Russia during a time of formal rule of Fyodor Ivanovich? For overcoming ruin and defense of the country in Moscow, the white and earth cities were built, on borders fortresses were built, so Moscow as a capital of Russian state was reconstructed. Stone strengthenings in Smolensk and Astrakhan are constructed, and those cities below are founded as Samara, Saratov, Tsaritsyn, Kursk, Belgorod, Yelets, and Ufa. A lot of towns were constructed during the time of rule of Fyodor Ivanovich and Boris Godunov. Here is a view of strengthenings in Smolensk. Establishment of Patriarchate. In 1589, a Patriarchate in Russia was established, and the first Russian Patriarch became Yov. I remind you that before introduction of Patriarchate in Russia, a metropolitan existed, and metropoly in Russia existed. And after the collapse of Byzantine Empire, Constantinople Patriarchate was under the power of Ottoman Empire, and it was a very strange thing. How could it be an Orthodox Patriarchate could be under the control of Muslim Ottoman Empire? And that's why it was decided in Russia to establish Patriarchate in Moscow, because Moscow was recognized among Russian priests as a third Rome. Third Rome, a capital of Western Roman Empire, second Rome, Constantinople, a capital of Byzantine Empire, and Moscow should be a capital of Orthodox Russian state. Fyodor Ivanovich, protecting the interest of noblemen, the Tsar in 1597 adopted decree on fixed years. Runaway peasants were subject to search within 5 years. Thus, already into the 16th centuries in Russia, the serfdom was practically issued. So, we can conclude that serfdom in Russia was eventually introduced at the end of the 16th century, during the time of rule of Fyodor Ivanovich and Boris Godunov. Godunov liquidates so-called white settlements and returns them in draft people. Godunov tried to increase taxation for town people. That's why so-called white settlements were liquidated. Foreign policy. Godunov was a very careful and very clever politician. In the south, he built frontier line protecting from attacks of Crimean Tatars. In 1586, it called a truce with Poland, and from 1591 to 1595, Russia was at war with Swedes for the coast of Baltic. As a result, Russia returned itself the lands lost during the Livonian War. Foreign policy. Look at this slide, you can see a fortress Ivangorod. Ivangorod was captured by Russian troops during this Russian-Swedish War of 1590-1593. Oglitsky investigation. After Fyodor's accession, younger son of Ivan the Terrible Dmitry, with mother Maria Nagaya, and by her brothers, it was sent to the destiny the city of Uglich. The Tsarevich had epilepsy, and on May 15 of 1591, Dmitry died from a knife wound. It was a very strange death, and this death was ground for a lot of rumors. Accused, the clerk Mikhail Bitiagovsky sent from Moscow his nephew Nikita Kachalov, the mother of the Tsarevich Vasilisa Volokhova, and her son Osip of murder. Nude claimed that the Tsarevich was killed by order of Boris Godunov. You see, Boris Godunov was a very hated person among people, among population of Russia, and that's why rumors accused Boris Godunov in a murder of Tsarevich Dmitry. The government appointed a special investigation of events in Uglitch. The boyar Vasily Shuisky headed the investigation, and the investigation recognized that murder was not a real thing, because the Tsarevich was pinned up by a knife in an attack of epilepsy, Patucci so-called, which happened during the game in Pug. Nude for mob killings and charged for the governor were sent into exile. Maria Nagaya is tonsured in the nun with the name Marfa. But death of the Tsarevich Dmitry was the ground for a lot of rumors among the people. One of the rumors tell us that the real Dmitry did not die. Instead of him, other child died, and the Tsarevich was saved and was brought up in secret place to a certain age. The official version raised doubts. Fedor had no children, and Nude hated Godunov. What opportunities were opened for Godunov by Dmitry's death? Head of the commission Vasily Shuisky was in distant relationships with executed Shuisky and in property with Godunov. His brother and Godunov were married to Maluta Skurata's daughters. The dispute on causes of death of Dmitry continues still. So it was a very strange death of the single son of Ivan the Terrible. What were reasons of distemper? First reason was Livonian War. The second reason was fight between seigneurial groups of boyars. The next reason was the main dynastic crisis, suppression of the dynasty of Rurik. Dynasty of Rurik stopped, and that's why distemper began in Russia. One more reason of distemper was hunger, fired of the peasantry against enslaving. What do we know about Boris Godunov? Years of rule of Boris Godunov were 1598-1605. Boris Fedorovich Godunov is a Tsar and the Grand Duke of all the Russia. He was born in 1551 and he died on the 13th of April of 1605. He died suddenly. Moscow swore to the son Fyodor, but in a month false Dmitry's adherents killed him with Mother, a son of Boris Godunov. In February of 1598, the last from a dynasty of Rurik, Ivan the Terrible's son Tsar Fyodor Yanovich, who did not leave posterity, died. He was childless. The territorial cathedral called about it elected to Boris Godunov's reign. However, emergence of a new political precedent, election of a new Tsar, created a number of consequences dangerous to the new Tsar in the state. And here a role was played by features of political culture and mentality of our ancestors, who saw in Godunov not the natural sovereign, the lords appointed, and only the person elected by the people. So, let it be concluded that Boris Godunov, in views of the people of this time, of the end of the 16th century, was not real Tsar. He was a false Tsar. According to estimations of Nicholas Karamzin, famous Russian historian, Boris Godunov was rather clever, but he was unhappy, and he had an unhappy destiny. What was domestic policy of Boris Godunov? In 1601-1603 in Russia there was an event known earlier, very poor harvest, and as a result As a result, a great hunger started in Russia. The case, unknown earlier, forced the population to believe that Godunov is an illegal governor. People began to talk between each other that Godunov is a legal governor, and a lot of revolts took place during this time. The most remarkable from them was the largest revolt took place in 1603-1604 under Serf Kosolap leadership. It was cruelly suppressed. Tsar Dmitry. On April the 13th of 1605, suddenly Boris Godunov died. On June the 1st, Fyodor overthrew Godunov. On June the 20th, False Dmitry's introduction to Moscow took place. On July 21, False Dmitry's wedding on the kingdom took place. Vasily Shuisky confirmed that the Tsarevich was not killed in Uglitch, and instead of it buried Popovich, another person. The impostor was recognized by Marfa Nagaya. Marfa Nagaya was very frightened by the supporters of False Dmitry I, and she was forced to recognize him as her own son. He was not her son, actually, but he was forced to recognize him. Who was False Dmitry I, Tsar of Moscow in 1605-1606? Let's have a look at this slide to the portrait of False Dmitry I. Boris Godunov's diplomas call him Grigory Otrepyev, the runaway monk. Historians Pagodin and Kostomarov doubted reliability of these data. 1601, False Dmitry served at the Prince Ostrogsky in Poland, studied at Aryan school, then served at Vishnevetsky, where appeared the son of Ivan the Terrible. Dmitry was supported by Grandis, talked over clergy adoption of Catholicism and promised to introduce it in Russia. False Dmitry I was very unusual Tsar, according to the views and estimations of Nicholas Karamzin. He was very unusual because of his education, because of his nature, his talent, and another qualities of his character. But together with the positive qualities of his character, he was extremely self-orientated. He was unusual Tsar. And a lot of his matters, a lot of his initiatives were met by Russian people with a misunderstanding and with a hostility even. One of the most contradictable acts of False Dmitry was his marriage. He decided to be married with Marina Mniszek, Polish girl, and Mniszek's acquaintance to False Dmitry happened about 1604, agreed to be his wife of the unknown and the ugly former Lucky Marine because of desire to become the queen and under the influence of the regiments of the Catholic clergy, which elected her by the truth of carrying out Catholicism to the Russian kingdom. So, Marina Mniszek decided to be married with False Dmitry, impostor, because Poland chose her as a bride for False Dmitry, as a tool to introduce Catholicism and Polish influence on Russian land. Initially, False Dmitry, the first impostor, took power in Russia without any difficulties, because hunger on his side was, doubts in legality of the Tsar, previous Tsar Boris Godunov. Kosalap revolts and its suppression was very helpful to False Dmitry. But together with this, simultaneously, opportunity of impostor to take power was very unstable. Mass hostility to Godunov was not eternal. An emergence of impostor should be a very short time period. So the next step was False Dmitry's falling. False Dmitry, as we imagine, lost all his supporters. He lost Poles as his supporters. He lost peasants because he did not restore St. George's Day. He lost support from the side of Cossacks, and eventually he lost support from Russian nobility and clergy because he broke Russian customs. As a result, there is no support in total, and impostor was doomed. Distemper was a very serious period for Russian history. Just imagine, Tsar Boris Fedorovich was a false Tsar in estimations of Russian people. Tsar Fyodor Borisovich was killed by rebels. Tsar Dmitry Ivanovich was a false Tsar. It was killed by conspirators. And a frequent change of Tsars, absence of a lawful Tsar, led to falling of the authority of the government, and probably it could lead to a total collapse of Russian state. It was a very hard time, time of troubles or distemper. False Dmitry's falling took place on the 17th of May of 1606 in Moscow. The revolt against False Dmitry broke out and he was killed. Here is a picture illustrated as the last minutes of Dmitry impostor. False Dmitry's body was burned and ashes were loaded in the gun and shot at the party from where he came, to the side of Poland westward. Who became Russian Tsar after execution of Dmitry impostor? The last Russian Tsar was elected as Vasily IV Shuisky from 1606 to 1610. Vasily IV Shuisky was a senior line of descendants of Alexander Nevsky, the Tsar of Moscow from 1606 to 1610. Vasily Shuisky government, his period of rule was very hard time for Russian history, because only Russian capital Moscow was under control of his government, and all the rest of Russian territory was out of his control. Cossacks became very strong opponents of Vasily Shuisky's power. Cossack in Turkic language means free person. Cossacks were inhabitants of the South Russian steppes, fluent of the Horde, the Crimea, the Moscow state, where their life was hunting, attacks, and robbery. They were very brave, professionally orientated to military affairs. One of the most important and one of the most interesting revolts was a revolt led by Ivan Isayevich Bolotnikov. Bolotnikov's revolt took place at the beginning of the 17th century. Bolotnikov collected a lot of his supporters in the face of Cossacks, in the face of nobility, and together with Pashkov, Lyapunov and Sumbulov's, Bolotnikov's regiments besieged Moscow. But Bolotnikov was defeated because near Moscow noble groups came over to Shuisky's side, trying to obtain support of boyars and noblemen. Supported previously Bolotnikov, Shuisky in 1707 issued a special decree about 15-year term of investigation of runaway peasants, and that's why noble leaders were convinced that battling for Tsar Dmitry they support adventurers, and they supported Tsar Vasily Shuisky. The second Russian impostor is known under the nickname of Tushina thief. In 1608, False Dmitry II invaded with the Polish groups and Cossacks to the borders of Russia. False Dmitry II's camp at the siege of Moscow was a village of Tushino. So his capital became Tushino, that's why he was nicknamed as a Tushino thief. From there his nickname. Polish invasion to Russia was very cruel, very aggressive, and together with the Polish intruders, Russia made invasion of Sweden, and it was a kind of foreign intervention to Russian affairs from the side of foreign countries. The beginning of Polish invasion was September of 1609. A siege of Smolensk by the troops of Sigismund III began. The next point in Polish advance to Moscow was the siege of Troitsa Sergiev's monastery. Defense of monastery continued 18 months. In January of 1610, Mikhail Skopin-Shuisky troops freed the monastery from a siege, and Mikhail Skopin-Shuisky became very popular among Moscow inhabitants. On March 12 of 1610, Mikhail Skopin-Shuisky solemnly entered to Moscow, and a lot of people respected him as possible successor of Vasily Shuisky. But suddenly, Voivod Skopin-Shuisky died. Moscow considered that he was poisoned by the wife of the imperial brother Dmitry Shuisky, Maluta Skuratov's daughter. And as a result, Vasily Shuisky government fell. Vasily Shuisky falling was caused by the growth of taxes, by evasion of Swedes from participation in fights after Tver, and invitation Swedes as the occasion for invasion Poles. Mysterious death of Skopin-Shuisky also led falling of Vasily Shuisky, and all that listed reasons led to the falling of popularity, total falling of popularity of Vasily Shuisky and his overthrow on July of 1610. And what did happen after the falling of Tsar Vasily IV Shuisky? So-called interregnum. You see, boyars decided to reign without Tsar. A 3 years period from 1610 to 1613 in Russia was known in our history, this period, as a 7 boyars rule. 7 boyars rule. Poles occurred in Moscow. Condition of calling of Vladislav, a son of Sigismund III, transitioned to orthodoxy, but Sigismund III forbade his son to become orthodoxal believer, and that's why Russian Patriarch Germogen refused to recognize Vladislav as a Russian Tsar. Poles tried to arrest Germogen and to force him to sign necessary documents according recognition of Vladislav as a Russian Tsar, but Germogen continued to refuse to do it. Moscow was actually occupied by Poles. Here is a picture illustrated as a process of negotiations between Germogen and Poles. Poles tried to force him to recognize Vladislav as a Russian Tsar, and he refused. As a result, Germogen was arrested by Poles and he died from hunger in 1612. But before it, Germogen issued a lot of diplomas to Russian people, to Russian citizens, and he asked them to provide a national movement for liberation of Russia, for independence of Russia from Pole intruders. First militia was convocated in 1611 according to letters of Patriarch Germogen. First militia was headed by Lyapunov, Trubetskoy and Zarutsky, so we can recognize noblemen and Cossacks in first militia as major parts of militia. So we can conclude that peasants were excluded from the participation in first militia, and it was a great mistake of the leaders of first militia. There were very strong and terrible contradictions between noblemen and Cossacks. As a result, first militia was defeated by Poles troops close to Moscow. A second militia was created by two people. Here is a portrait of them. At the bottom of our slide, right side, you can see Kuzma Minin. At the right corner of our slide, you can see Prince Pozharsky, a second leader of second militia. Second militia started to be formed at Nizhny Novgorod, and second militia became much more successful than the first militia in a matter of liberation of Moscow from Poles intruders. Here is a famous monument at the center of Russia, at Moscow, at Red Square, and the title of this monument to the citizen Minin and Prince Pozharsky, Grateful Russia. This monument was created in 1880 to recognition of the great patriotic activity of Minin and Pozharsky, who helped to liberate our motherland, Russia, from an intervention, from a Polish intrusion. Second militia moved from Nizhny Novgorod through Kostroma and Yaroslavl to Moscow. Nizhny Novgorod, Kostroma, Yaroslavl were rich trade cities not affected by war, and these cities collected a lot of money, and it was very helpful for liberation of Russian land and construction of a very powerful militia. Polish Sirs besieged in the Moscow Kremlin gave up to the Russian militia. Here is a picture illustrated as consequences of the storm of Moscow by the second militia. The second militia approached Moscow in August of 1612, also connected from the remains of the first militia. And on August of 22nd, the attempt of troops of the Hetman Chodkiewicz, Polish Hetman Chodkiewicz, to break to Moscow is beaten off. And remember that on October 22nd, Kitai-Gorod, one of the central parts of Moscow, was taken. And according to a new style of our time, the 22nd of October is recognized as the 4th of November. And as you remember, we just spent one of the most interesting and most patriotic holidays in our history, the Day of People's Unity. The Day of People's Unity of Russia of the 4th of November is totally devoted to liberation of Moscow by the regiments of the 2nd Militia from Polish intervents. On October 26th of 1612, the Kremlin is freed from Polish intervents. And now let's remember Susanin's feat. In February of 1613, the Polish group ransacked on the Kostroma region in search of Mikhail Romanov and his mother, the nun Marfa. They intended to captivate or destroy the real Russian applicant for the Moscow throne, because Poles decided, nevertheless, to the laws of Moscow, they decided to make Vladislav Russian Tsar. Polish king's son Vladislav, a son of Sigismund III, Russian Tsar. Despite his refusal to be an Orthodox believer, despite that fact, they decided to adopt him as a Russian Tsar. Near Domnina, Poles met the rural head Ivan Susanin and ordered him to show the way to the village where they can meet Mikhail Romanov, 16 years old, with his mother. Susanin managed to send to Domnina the son-in-law Bogdan Sabinin with the instruction to equip Mikhail Romanov in a Partiv monastery, and itself led Poles to the opposite side on swamps. He was tortured and executed, but Susanin's fate allowed Mikhail safe to reach a Partiv monastery. And Susanin became a national hero for Russia because he saved life of future Russian Tsar, the founder of Romanov's dynasty. And here is a title page of Imperial Diploma of Mikhail, which to Ivan Susanin's family is given various privileges for the salvation of the life of the first Russian Tsar of Romanov's dynasty, Mikhail Fedorovich. And we came to the end of our today's lecture. Let's have a look to our consequent slide. Mikhail's Romanov election. On February of 1613, territorial cathedral took place. An election of the Tsar took place also. Look at this picture, please. 16 years old Mikhail Fedorovich Romanov was elected as the first Russian Tsar from Romanov's dynasty. Romanov's calling on the kingdom. Here is a picture illustrated as a process of the calling of Mikhail Romanov to the kingdom. Mikhail Romanov election to the kingdom was beginning of a new Russian dynasty of Tsars, Romanovs. It was the second and the last dynasty of Russian Tsars. Romanov's dynasty continued up to the revolution, February Revolution of 1917. And the last Russian Tsar and emperor from this dynasty was Nicholas II Alexandrovich Romanov. And Mikhail Romanov was the first from this dynasty. He was the founder of Romanov's dynasty. And we can conclude that time of troubles came to the end with the day of election of Mikhail Fyodorich Romanov as Russian ruler and founder of Yu dynasty. Thank you for your attention. And I ask chiefs of your groups to send me lists of present students. Do it, please. Thank you for your attention. If you have no questions, so goodbye.